Brothers and sisters, the chains of slavery were never truly broken. They only changed shape. They only changed masks. But they remained on our people. Today, under the sky of Burkina Faso, I declare this: no empire, no Western silence, no Paris, no Washington shall ever again decide the fate of African children. If they close their eyes to human trafficking, we will open ours. If they ignore the cries of our people, we will answer them. Africa will not bow to a marketplace of flesh. We rise not as victims, but as a nation of defiance and dignity. Did slavery ever end for Africa? The textbooks say yes. The treaties say yes. But the reality says no. In the Sahel today, over 50,000 souls vanish into trafficking routes each year. While Western powers look away, Paris pretends it sees nothing. Washington speaks of human rights, but does nothing. Yet in Ouagadougou, a young captain named Ibrahim Traoré dared to break the silence. For 48 hours, Burkina Faso became the front line, not only against traffickers, but against centuries of complicity. This was not simply a rescue mission. It was a declaration of war against neo-colonialism itself. History screams to Africa. 4 centuries ago, millions were stolen from their homes, chained in iron, and dragged across the Atlantic. That crime was not only against bodies, it was against identity, against dignity. From the cotton fields of Mississippi to the streets of Harlem, the descendants of those stolen never forgot. And in West Africa today, the echoes are alive. In children trafficked through desert routes, in women sold near mining camps, in men forced into invisible labor. This is modern slavery. And just as Thomas Sankara once warned, it wears the mask of aid and development. But behind it lies the same empire. For decades, African politics has been shaped by powers that profit from our suffering. The geopolitics of Africa has been written in treaties signed in Paris, not in the villages of the Sahel. But then came a new defiance in Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré declared that silence is betrayal. He chose confrontation, not compromise. When intelligence revealed networks worth millions, backed by technology and foreign complicity, Traoré acted. For 2 nights, Burkina Faso became both battlefield and courtroom. And in that struggle, a truth was born. Slavery has not ended, but Africa will end it on her own terms. The world tells us slavery ended. Textbooks write it neatly: abolished, outlawed, confined to history. Politicians in Paris and Washington repeat the same line. Yet if slavery truly ended, why are African children still vanishing in the night? Why do women disappear across desert routes, reappearing only as nameless victims in foreign markets? Why do men work in mines with no contracts, no freedom, and no dawn beyond their cages? This is not history. It is modern slavery. And it is happening under the very nose of the global powers who pretend to defend human rights. In Burkina Faso, the reality is undeniable. Intelligence officers whispered of trucks loaded with infants, of steel containers where teenagers suffocated in silence, of networks worth more than $150 million, moving flesh as if it were gold. These were not local criminals alone. Behind the shadows were structures polished with the logos of international NGOs, reinforced by European technology, and protected by the blindness of Western diplomacy. Paris looked away. Washington shifted the conversation to democracy and stability. The suffering of Africans was not their priority, it was their currency. It was here that Ibrahim Traoré faced the choice: ignore it, and he would inherit the same silence that had allowed empires to thrive for centuries. Confront it, and he would risk betrayal, infiltration, and the wrath of global interests who profited from chaos. Traoré chose confrontation. Orders were whispered across Ouagadougou: trust no one, move tonight, let no child be sold again. For 48 hours, Burkina Faso became both battlefield and courtroom. Soldiers raided compounds hidden in the dunes, broke open steel containers, and uncovered children with wrists bruised by ropes. A little girl's trembling words, "Don't let them take me again," cut deeper than any bullet. It was more than a plea. It was the voice of centuries, from the ships of the Atlantic slave trade to the deserts of Niger. The same cry heard by ancestors shackled and dragged to foreign lands was now echoing in the Sahel. And when the bullets began to fall, Traoré did not retreat. He advanced in fatigues, not in suits. He became more than a commander. He became a symbol of African politics at its most raw. A continent long dismissed as helpless was now acting with defiance. Each rescued child was not just a statistic, it was a blow against the system that had reduced Africans to commodities for 500 years. The West called it organized crime. Traoré called it by its true name, slavery. And he reminded the world that Thomas Sankara had warned of this long ago. Slavery changes its mask, but not its soul. Sankara stood against the colonial hand disguised as aid. Traoré stood against the modern empire disguised as indifference. Both knew the truth. Silence is complicity. In those 48 hours, the message spread like wildfire. Villagers lined the roads holding torches as convoys of rescued children passed. Mothers wept not only for their own, but for the dignity of a nation that dared to fight where empires had refused. "Burkina Faso is not for sale," they chanted. Their voices carried across the Sahel, carried into the diaspora, carried into the ears of those who still wonder if Africa will ever rise. Meanwhile, Paris grew uneasy. Newspapers in France spoke vaguely of instability. Analysts in Washington muttered about authoritarian risks. But their discomfort betrayed the truth. The West was not afraid of crime. It was afraid of a new precedent. An African leader had acted without their permission. An African army had defended its children without Western orders. For them, that was the real crime.
The night of resistance ended, but the dawn that followed in Burkina Faso was unlike any other. What began as a rescue operation had transformed into a manifesto of freedom. The faces of the children, wrapped in blankets, eyes wide with fear and relief, became the living proof of a truth too long ignored. Slavery is not history, it is alive. But for the first time in decades, Africa was not silent. Africa was not waiting. Africa was fighting back. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people, not as a polished politician behind marble walls, but as a soldier whose boots were still covered in the dust of the operation. His voice shook not with fear, but with conviction. "We are not here to beg the West for recognition. We are here to protect our children. Burkina Faso will never again allow the sale of African flesh." The declaration echoed across the Sahel. It was more than politics. It was more than security. It was Africa breaking its silence. For centuries, our continent has been spoken about in conference rooms in Paris, Brussels, Washington, and London. But rarely has it been allowed to speak for itself. Now, in the streets of Ouagadougou, the continent was roaring, "Our dignity is not negotiable." Think of the courage this took. Behind Traore were not endless resources or modern technology. His nation is small, its economy strained, its military modest. Against him stood networks worth millions, backed by shadowy figures in foreign capitals, protected by silence from international institutions. By every rational calculation, he should have lost. But history is not always written by those with the most weapons. Sometimes it is written by those who refuse to bow. The story of Africa has long been the story of plunder. From the gold of Ghana to the oil of Nigeria, from the cobalt of Congo to the cotton of Mali, our resources have filled foreign coffers while our people remained in poverty. Now even our children were being stolen in the night. This was not just theft, it was the attempt to erase a future. Traoré's fight was not simply about roads or schools or even borders. It was about existence. It was about proving that Africa is not a body to be consumed, but a soul that resists. International reactions came quickly. European headlines spoke of instability. Western analysts warned of authoritarian tendencies. The same voices that had remained silent while children were trafficked suddenly found the energy to criticize a government that dared to stop it. But Traoré understood their fear. It was not about democracy, it was about precedent. If one African nation can stand, others may follow. And if the Sahel rises, the centuries-old chain of dependency may finally break. The people of Burkina Faso did not need convincing. Villagers who once felt abandoned now joined hands in the Dunu spirit. Let's do it together. Communities began organizing patrols along remote routes. Women volunteered to cook for soldiers on night missions. Farmers donated food, believing that each grain given to the struggle was an investment in freedom. The fight had become a national covenant, a bond of blood and sacrifice. But beyond the borders, something else was happening. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Conakry, whispers grew louder. Leaders who had long walked carefully to avoid offending their former colonizers began to see in Traoré's defiance a mirror of their own people's hopes. Could it be that the Sahel, once dismissed as the graveyard of empires, was now becoming the cradle of Africa's rebirth? Still, the dangers were immense. Trafficking networks do not die easily. They have financiers, they have protection, they have the shadow of global demand. To strike at them is to strike at a system older than many nations. Traoré knew retaliation would come, through sabotage, through propaganda, through attempts to isolate Burkina Faso on the world stage. But he was ready. If they isolate us, let them know we are not afraid of loneliness. We are afraid only of betraying our children. The movement was no longer about one man. It had become about memory and destiny. The ghosts of Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, and all who dared to dream of an Africa unchained seemed to rise again in the chants of the people. They were not chanting for aid, they were chanting for sovereignty. They were not begging for inclusion, they were demanding respect. And in that moment, the world was forced to listen, not because it wanted to, but because the silence of centuries had been shattered. No longer could Africa be portrayed only as victim, waiting for saviors. In Ouagadougou, Africa had shown itself as warrior, carving its own salvation. Yet the struggle is far from over. The fight against trafficking is not a battle of days, it is a war of generations. But the victory of those 48 hours lit a fire. A little girl once chained in the back of a container now dreams of becoming a doctor. A boy who nearly disappeared into the shadows now carries a school book instead of fear. These are not small victories. They are revolutions written in the lives of the young. So we must ask ourselves, will the world remember this story, or will it bury it as it buried so many others? Will Paris, Washington, and Brussels admit their complicity, or will they hide behind new excuses? Perhaps they will remain silent. Perhaps they will twist the narrative. But it does not matter, because the truth is already alive in the heart of Africa. And the truth is this: slavery did not end with abolition. It did not end with treaties. It ends only when those who suffer it rise up and break it with their own hands. In Burkina Faso, that breaking has begun. This is not just the story of a nation. It is the story of a continent daring to stand against centuries of exploitation. It is the story of a people refusing to be defined by chains. And it is the beginning of something far greater than even Traore himself. A movement of defiance that may one day stretch from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Cairo to Cape Town. And so, brothers and sisters, we close with this. Africa is no longer waiting. Africa is no longer begging. Africa is no longer silent. The Sahel has spoken, and its words are thunder. Never again, not one more child, not one more chain, not one more night of silence. The future will not be given to Africa. It will be taken, built, and defended by Africa herself. And when history remembers this age, it will say, here in the dust of Burkina Faso, in the courage of its people, Africa began to write her own freedom again.